I'm mostly a lurker here, but I've considered sharing my story several times. I was hesitant because no one knows about this, neither my family nor my friends. I've kept this secret for 10 years and figured it was time to share it. I think there are valuable lessons from my experience, so here goes. Warning, long story ahead. For reference, I am a 27-year-old female, and this story takes place 10 years ago when I was 17. I had just started university and was excited about a fresh start, since I'd always been a nerdy outcast in high school. I had never had a boyfriend before, nor had I been on a date, so I was naive and optimistic about boys. My introverted and awkward personality hadn't changed, so it's safe to say that I didn't meet any interesting guys at school. One late night, I was working on an assignment on my laptop when I received a request on MSN Messenger. The email address was a boy's name with some numbers. The name was clearly ethnic and likely someone of the same origin as me. Intrigued, I accepted the request. For the sake of the story, we'll call this boy Ken. We started chatting and I asked him how he got my email address. He avoided answering. I let it go, not thinking much of it. This was a time when it was normal to accept anyone and everyone as a friend on Facebook and other social media platforms. As Ken and I continued to talk, I learned that he lived in my city and apparently wasn't much older than me. As I'd guessed, our roots were in the same country, let's call it motherland. I asked him why he didn't have a picture of himself on his profile. This led him to suggest that we turn on our webcam so he could see me too. I initially declined, but he insisted. Somehow he convinced me and we both turned on our webcams. I was pleasantly surprised and somewhat relieved to see that Ken was a good-looking young guy, chatting from the comfort of his bedroom, seemingly very normal. Our MSN chats continued for a couple of weeks. They turned into texts and we even had a few phone calls after I agreed to give him my phone number. I started to develop a crush on Ken. He asked me to go out a couple of times, but I was always busy with school, and our schedules didn't line up. Finally, we found an afternoon when we were both free and scheduled a lunch date. Ken had a car and offered to pick me up from my university after my classes. I was a bit overdressed for my C++ programming class, but just right for the lunch date we had planned at a local vegetarian restaurant. Stupidly, I didn't tell any of my friends where I was going or with whom because I was embarrassed about going on my first date, at almost 18, with someone who had randomly added me on MSN. I waited outside my building when a black car with heavily tinted windows pulled up beside me. The passenger side window rolled down, and there was Ken sitting in the driver's seat. I was happy to see that he was as cute in person as he was on webcam. However, I wasn't expecting the intense smell of marijuana coming from the car. Not relevant, but part of the first impression. Admittedly, I was a bit taken aback and concerned that he might be driving high. He unlocked the doors and motioned for me to get in, so I did without dispute. As I sat down in the passenger seat, he immediately put his hand on my thigh. I nervously shifted my leg away. "So," I started, "do you know where the restaurant is? I can guide you if you want." He smirked at me but didn't say anything and just started driving. Okay, kinda weird. I thought maybe he was just nervous or awkward, both of which I could sympathize with, so I let it be. I was about to try some small talk, which I'm not good at, when I noticed him heading towards the highway ramp. I started to worry because the restaurant was really close to my campus, and there was no reason for us to be getting on the highway. You don't need to take the highway. The restaurant is really close by. I can guide you," I said, trying to keep my voice steady but nervous. Ken finally spoke for the first time since I got in the car. I thought maybe we could just go to my place instead. We can play Need for Speed and I can make lunch for you. I was 17 on my way to the house of a guy I'd just met for the first time, and I hadn't told anyone where I was going. My mind was racing. I knew this was a terrible idea. Despite the clear red flags, I didn't want to ruin our first date by rejecting his offer. So like an idiot, I reluctantly agreed to avoid being rude. We made it to his house. It was apparently his family's home and was in a sort of shady neighborhood. We stepped inside and, of course, no one was home except us. It was sparsely furnished and looked unkempt, which struck me as odd for a family home. He told me his Xbox was in his bedroom. I hesitated in the doorway, but he sat at the foot of his bed in front of the TV and patted the empty space beside him. There was literally nowhere else to sit in his room, so I cautiously sat down, keeping as much distance as I could. I started to relax as we played Need for Speed, and he made us peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. I was about to laugh at myself for being overly paranoid when Ken did something bizarre. He got onto the bed and sat directly behind me, his legs on either side of me, an extremely awkward position, and tried to guide my hands on the controller. I started to ask him what he was doing, and as if this wasn't uncomfortable enough, his hands moved from the controller and slid up under my shirt. That's when I really started to panic. I thought he was going to grope my chest, but instead he started squeezing and massaging my belly. I was more than a little chubby back then, freshman 15 and then some, so you can imagine how I felt. I dropped the controller in shock and quickly stood up, fixing my shirt. I was at a loss for words, and he did nothing but smirk and say he liked it. I felt completely disgusted and violated. I'd had enough. I lied and told him I had a group project to work on and needed to go. He asked where I lived so he could drop me home. Thankfully, I had the sense not to tell him and asked him to drop me back to school instead, where I would supposedly meet my classmates. He agreed. After that very uncomfortable first date, I decided I didn't want to talk to Ken anymore. I didn't block him on MSN or on my phone, our only two methods of communication, but I rarely responded to his messages and ignored all his calls. Once, he messaged me on MSN around 11 p.m., asking me to come over and saying he would send a cab to bring me to his place. Thoroughly annoyed, I responded, "What do you take me for? Why do you think I would want to do that?" He replied, "No sex, I promise." Just bizarre. I was disgusted and didn't even respond. He kept trying to contact me for months and then suddenly vanished. I figured he'd finally gotten the point. Now, I wish the story ended here, but it doesn't. I last heard from Ken in late February. He stopped trying to contact me shortly after Valentine's Day. In April, my two nuclear family members and I went on holiday to visit another relative, who we'll call Anne, who was living in the Caribbean at the time. Anne, whom I love dearly, was and still is a bit eccentric. She considers herself very spiritual and is an active member of a large, well-known spiritual organization. She is deeply connected with Motherland, more than the rest of us are, and makes frequent visits there. While we stayed with her in the Caribbean, she told us about her most recent spiritual trip to Motherland, where she met a wealthy and well-connected local woman through the organization. This woman quickly became a very close friend. Let's call her Connie, the con artist. During our visit, Anne introduced us to Connie virtually over Skype because Connie lives in Motherland. We chatted with her a few times throughout our vacation via Skype and got to know her a little. Little did we know back then that Connie, who Anne had spontaneously met halfway across the world in Motherland, would soon wreak utter havoc on our lives. That's a story I'm not, and may never be ready to tell because of how many lives were affected and the severity of the damage that was inflicted. What you need to know is that Connie was an outright criminal and con artist who had been targeting our family long before Anne met her. Their meeting was no coincidence. Not only did she manage to steal over $100,000 from our family, but she also took any peace of mind or sense of security we had ever had. When we finally caught on and confronted her, she insisted we were mistaken but then disappeared into thin air once we forced her out of our lives. You're probably wondering what this has to do with my story about Ken. Well, get this. The situation with Connie lasted many months. The whole thing is kind of a blur now, but we first spoke to her online in April, and I remember the ordeal lasting well into the fall. While she normally resided in Motherland, Anne had invited her to visit and stay with us where we, my family and I, live. That's when things really took a turn for the worse. Some important things I clearly remember are: 1. The whole time she stayed with us, she was trying to convince me to transfer to a very obscure school and program in the US. I don't even live in the US, and was actually getting very pushy about it. And 2, she asked me if I was a virgin and told me to save myself from my husband. Disturbing, I know. During this time, I was so emotionally drained and stressed that I didn't think about anything but the situation at hand. I had stopped socializing almost entirely, and even started habitually skipping classes. I had lost contact with my high school friends, and my university friends were too new to really notice. So my strange behavior and new destructive habits went unnoticed. Fast forward to one day after Connie's final disappearance in the fall. I was at home with my dad when my cell phone rang. I looked at the caller ID and it was a number I hadn't saved. It showed a name. The first name was a man's name and the last name was the same as Connie's. My heart dropped into my stomach. I started to panic and ran into my bedroom to answer the call. I had no idea what to expect. When I picked up the phone, I was greeted by a familiar voice. It was Ken. I honestly thought I was going to puke when I realized he might be part of this whole sick plot. Of course, I don't have hard evidence to prove he was connected to Connie. But let me explain. The timing of his appearance and reappearance in my life, the last name, a fairly unique surname originating from the part of Motherland where Connie is from. I had never known Ken's last name until then. And the fact that he contacted me out of the blue and I had no idea why or how were all just too bizarre to be a mere coincidence. I freaked out when Ken called and told him that if he ever called me again, I would call the police. His response was a weird, dry half laugh, and then he said, "Well, okay then," in the creepiest voice you can imagine, and hung up. I knew in my gut that this was their last attempt to get back in touch and somehow slither their way back into my and my family's lives. Thankfully, I never heard from Ken again after that day. A while after this all ended, I talked with a family member who was also closely involved about the whole ordeal. She mentioned that she had sensed something extremely wrong when Connie was pushing to have me sent off to the US to that obscure school. She had an unshakable feeling that Connie was involved in some sort of human trafficking and that if I left, she would never see me again. The horrifying pieces came together for me at that time. I was just too naive to have seen it before. The memories flooded back when I heard that. How Ken had told me, "No sex, I promise," when he invited me over, and how Connie had told me to remain a virgin. As I said, I had never told anyone about Ken, nor about the weird conversation with Connie. I strongly believe that Ken was somehow a player in Connie's scheme and was just there to keep me away from guys and prevent me from having a boyfriend. For those who may wonder, we never call the police on Connie or Ken because nothing illegal happened at face value. It's very hard to explain. I tried to find Ken online many times after this all ended. I don't know why. I felt like I wanted to expose him or call him out, and couldn't find any information on him, not by the name Ken nor by the name on the caller ID. It was as if he didn't even exist. Also, I'm awful at directions and didn't remember his address or where his house was exactly. I'm sorry if this story is convoluted or confusing. I'm trying to get my point across without giving out names or too many details, which makes it a bit challenging. I hope this can serve as a warning to young people to never trust anyone blindly, to do thorough checks on people, especially those you meet online, and to be very aware and wary of people's intentions. Also, from this incident onward, I can't stomach a lot of these spiritual organizations. I never liked the idea of them to begin with, but now I've truly experienced how they can attract vulnerable people and unsavory characters looking for someone vulnerable to prey on. No judgment for those who are into that sort of thing. It's just definitely not for me. I'd like to hear what you think about this. Do you think my suspicions are plausible? What do you make of this? Stay safe, everyone, and to Ken and Connie, if I see either of you again, I'll kick you in the face. Edit 1. I didn't think people would be so interested in knowing which country these scammers came from. This is a throwaway account, so whatever. For all you who said India, you're correct. Edit 2. Part of the purpose of sharing this experience was to alert others to potential dangers like these. I'd be doing you a disservice if I didn't release this information. This spiritual organization was Art of Living, and this wasn't my first bad experience with them. Edit 3. I see AOL is getting a lot of attention here, and I think I need to be more clear and provide some additional information. Connie was not an AOL leader, representative, or anything like that. She seemed to be a participant or lingerer who was there under the false guise of being a wealthy, well-connected woman, as I mentioned. I have no doubt that shady characters flock to places like AOL, looking for easy targets, but I'm not sure if that speaks to the organization itself. I am not saying that AOL was involved in the potential human trafficking scheme. This just happened about 15 minutes ago, and it was one of the weirdest encounters I've ever had. My family and I'm a 22-year-old girl for context, were sitting in our living room watching TV after dinner. All of a sudden, there was an unexpected knock at the front door. I went to open it, and there were 3 young teens who looked like they were sophomores in high school that I didn't know. They told me that a few guys were following them and they needed to look like they knew someone. I told them immediately to come inside to avoid the people following them. The teens explained that it was 3 younger boys, probably about 8th grade, who had been following them as they walked about a mile from a nearby gas station to my neighborhood. I went outside to see if I could spot the boys, and sure enough, they were just down the street. When I stepped outside, they yelled, "Lacey, is that you?" I didn't answer but went back inside and asked the girls seeking refuge if any of them were named Lacey. None were. My dad then went outside to tell the boys to move along, and they got super mouthy and rude. Eventually, they went up the street and out of sight. However, they came back down a few minutes later, so I opened the door and yelled for them to leave, but they argued with me and wouldn't go anywhere. My dad went back outside and a neighbor heard the yelling and came to see what was happening. With the threat of 2 grown men, the boys finally left. Not without some attitude, though. I then drove the 3 teens back to one of their houses so they could evade the boys and get back home safely. Something was really off about the interactions with the young boys. I'm not sure what they were looking to do or if they were just looking for trouble. But something didn't sit right with me. I'm just glad the 3 teens felt my house was a safe place to come.